Frey guided the design and building of the Treadwell Ceramic Arts Center, and in 1999 was awarded the status of Professor Emerita. She received an honorary doctorate of fine arts in 2000, and the following year, the Viola Frey Distinguished Visiting Professor Endowment was created to honor her life and work. And that might sound like a simple thing to some, but it's quite a significant thing and makes a major impact on what we can actually do here. So Del came to CCA previously for a symposium called Data Clay, and I'll read you a sentence here about that. We gathered innovators in the fields of ceramic design and digital fabrication to subvert the typical expectations and limitations associated with both traditional materials and new technology. So it wasn't just about 3D printing or laser cutting. It was about how do you bring those things together with pinching and coiling in a kind of spectrum or a continuum. And it was at that time that I realized it's not really sufficient to have Del here for one lecture, right? We needed this kind of deeper experience with his knowledge and his way of teaching. Well, Del's here with his wife, Sanam Imami, and their son, William, and it's not a small feat to steal 2 faculty and a small baby from a state university in Colorado. So I have to take just a minute to thank Tammy Ray Carlin, our provost, for her support, and of course the good people in the Fine Arts Office who take this idea and actually get Del here. So thanks to Julie and Em for making it happen. Okay. Del has a BS from the University of Oregon in '99, and in 2005 he got his MFA at Alfred. He's shown at a number of places. I'll just give you the highlights: the Denver Art Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, Milwaukee Art Museum, and in the Korean Ceramics Biennial. So I think you got a sense from me talking about data clay what I found interesting about having Del here. It's not really that he uses 3D printing technology in his work. It's the way that he looks at that and the way he presents that lens in the classroom. So I was having some trouble describing that last night, and so I wrote an email to 2 friends, mutual friends of ours. And what I got back was an email that Del wrote to one of them, which I'm going to share with you tonight, which I think better illustrates than my own language the way that he looks at teaching and making. So this is Del Harrow in his own words. This semester, in the beginning pottery course, we are taking a few minutes at the beginning of each class to try to learn to juggle. When students asked at the beginning of the semester why they were learning to juggle in art class, I told them I didn't know. Even though I thought I knew, I didn't want to say, for fear that by trying to explain, I would limit what we might discover. I said instead that I didn't know why, but I felt it was important. And also that it was important that they feel this importance in themselves. So I would need something from them, for them to tell me why. And for a moment, I felt very brave, both for having admitted that I didn't know, and also for hopefully having created a little more space for us all to not know together. So twice a week in the morning before we begin our class, we have gone outside, and together we carefully throw tennis balls in the air and try to catch them, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And when we drop them, pick them up and start again. This last Wednesday morning, the most recent moment for us to practice this little ritual, I found myself listening to the plop, plop, plop rhythm of the balls dropping to the ground. This deeply human rhythm, the rhythm of small errors and corrections. This rhythm is now so much more open and spare than when we began to learn to juggle in August. The time and distance between the drops grows larger and larger with each day's practice. This plop-plop rhythm reminds me of those bent nails strewn about Thoreau's cabin, artifacts of practice of our failures, both small and large, trying in earnest to hit the nail, to catch the ball, and missing once, and then picking up another and trying again. Mr. Del Harrow.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Thank you for that introduction. It's so many it's warm thoughts and memories from I think these friends who we share, and really a lot of connections, and meaningful relationships that have grown, out of the last time I was here at CCA for the Data Clay conference that Nathan mentioned, and it feels like these, friendships and long collaborations are really already starting to take shape in the short time that we've spent here already. So, Sonam and William and I are so excited to be here. Thank you to everyone who's helped to make our visit possible. We really appreciate it. I'm going to switch back and forth a little bit between reading and not. I used to be able to remember everything I wanted to say for an hour-long talk without notes, but I'm turning 40 this year, and my memory already feels like it's starting to go, which is scary. My wife and I also have a 15-month-old son, so the last year has involved this kind of massive reorganization of mental space. So I think I'll blame it on that as well. As Nathan mentioned, we're here from Colorado. Sonam and I both teach in the pottery area at Colorado State University. This is our area at CSU. This is an amazing piece of Sonam's. My wife, who is teaching a throwing class this semester, and she'll be giving a lecture on her work next week, which you guys should all make time to attend. At CSU, I teach sculpture, I teach in pottery, I also teach sculpture and digital fabrication. When I first got to Colorado State, I spent a lot of time developing this lab space, and building this lab space up involved a whole bunch of questions that I think a lot of art departments are asking right now, many of the 3D media specifically. So basically, how do all of these digital tools get integrated into the space of an art school and then into a curriculum? There have been a bunch of parts to this, and we can sort of get into that later if you guys have questions about that project. But I really wanted to show you, to begin, this one project, this teaching project that I've been really excited about. So this was actually a design build class that I taught a couple of years ago. It was a collaboration with an artist named Harvey Meadows. He's been running this project for about 15 years now, called the Artstream Nomadic Gallery. Basically, it's an Airstream trailer that he's retrofitted as a portable gallery space. And in it, he shows some of the best studio pottery being made in the United States today. The original trailer was getting older, and he'd recently purchased this new empty 19-foot Airstream. He wanted to turn this new trailer into a gallery space, so he reached out to me about doing the project in our shop and using all of our digital fabrication tools. So we decided to teach this as a semester-long design build project. So the group of students taking the course, they were all totally new to digital fabrication technology, so it involved kind of getting everyone up and running with software. We taught a whole range of different tools that were available in the shop. This is a little scale model that we built of the Airstream, and the first thing we actually did is we decided we needed to make a little version of the Airstream trailer itself. So our first project was to really carefully model the actual aluminum trailer and then unfold it into a pattern, which we've been working on in the 3D digital tools class over the last few weeks. We've been working on the same workflow, and then we had it cut out of thin sheet aluminum, and we put this thing back together, and then we made these small models as mock-ups to go inside. I think one of the really exciting things to me about bringing this software, these digital software environments into an art school setting, which was maybe a kind of unexpected outcome, which sort of occurred specifically because of this kind of design build class, is that the space of the software creates this incredible environment for really rich cooperative and collaborative work. So this is a kind of master model that we were working on, and we had 12 different students all really directly contributing to editing, building upon this one piece, really. These are some pictures of the small mock-up as we're putting them together, and then we move to the full-scale model. It's us putting it together in the studio. And then the full-scale piece in the trailer interior. And we actually took this trailer to the NCCA conference this year, and it was installed inside the convention center in Kansas City, and we curated an exhibition that went in the trailer of all ceramic work making use of digital technology in some way. So I just wanted to show you this project as a kind of segue into the main kind of practice of my studio work. Just because I sort of wanted to point to, sort of give a little shout out to all of the connections, I think, with architecture and design in my work. I've had a number of these really long and meaningful conversations and collaborations with architects. As Nathan said, you know, we first met, and I first had the opportunity to come here to CCA because of our mutual friend Joshua Stein, who's an architect in the LA area. Joshua taught here for a semester. For a long time, we've been working on this sort of sprawling collaboration called Data Clay. And I've learned a tremendous amount from these conversations. So I think the work takes a lot from the methodologies of architecture and design. At the same time, I'm sort of really clear that it ultimately takes the form of sculpture. So that's the outcome. So the title of this talk is Equivalent Volumes, and this is also the title of the work that's up in the my contribution to the ceramics departmental show right now. I think it's always really interesting to start a talk with the thing you've made most recently. You know, it's the work that feels the most on the mind in that moment. When I give artist talks, they're usually organized through some kind of combination of thematic and chronological structures, and that'll be the case with this lecture. But I'm also going to try something else, which is to introduce a sort of circular or elliptical form. And I think this form makes sense with both the objects, but also the thinking at play in the work. So this piece is a kind of a still life. I'll talk more about the idea of the still life a little bit later. It's an idea that's always really operative in my studio. This little piece or installation is organized around these 4 geometric solids. They're all hand-built out of clay. And then there's this bronze cast of an aloe plant and these 2 large photographs that occupy another kind of an orbit in the space. These 4 clay objects all contain the same volume. The amount of volume they contain is specific. So it comes from this object in a photograph of the potter Lucy Ree, taken by Edward Snowden in 1990. This photograph is a portrait, but it also feels like a kind of a still life. So the table surface is a compositional structure, the light in the image, the relationship between the fullness of the jar and Rhee's sort of tiny, almost desiccated body. The pot and her form occupy almost the same space. This is a piece by Lucy Rhee. She was a really important modernist potter. She was born in Vienna. Her parents were friends with Sigmund Freud. She later moved to Great Britain. So all of the objects on the table contain the same volume as this object. It's called a moon jar. It's a traditional Korean form. It's about the idea of the fullness of the moon, or creating a volume that creating a pot that contains as much volume as possible. So it's as round as it can possibly be. This pot was given to Rhee by Bernard Leach in 1943. So this piece is really about volume and the possibility, or maybe the impossibility, of equivalency. Volume is a really fundamental idea for pottery form, so something I've been interested in for a long time, working with ceramics. This idea of volume is something that I became particularly interested in recently when our son William was born. So watching his head come out as he was born, the head is so flexible and malleable. And I remember the midwife just like reaching and digging her fingers into his head and pulling. And it's this kind of terrifying thing. I mean, it's incredibly terrifying. And he came out and he had this really squished head. It's like this long cone. And it actually took a long time for it to become round again. So actually a number of months. We had to take him to physical therapy. He had this one really flat side on the back of his head, and because it was flat, he would sleep on it. And then because of that, he'd only turn his head in one direction. It all sounds really bad and dramatic, but it's actually a really common thing. But so we were going through this long process of trying to shape the volume of his head. No matter what shape it was, it had to contain a certain volume. It had to hold his little brain. So the shape keeps morphing, but it needs to hold that brain, that mind, that individual consciousness. What is that amount? What's the amount of volume that container needs to hold? So all the objects on this table, they contain a certain volume, but they also contain this thought, or this collection of thoughts. They're containers that allow for this thinking about volumes, a thinking that can contain both a Korean jar and the changing shape of our son's head, and then some larger or more abstract question that both of these things push up against. How much does a container contain? In the craft theory seminar, we've been talking a lot about the relationships between concept and medium. And for me, the work always begins with a kind of intuition. It's more of a question than a real idea. So I feel like I always need both the technique and the material to think through or think with. I can maybe have part of a thought without beginning to actually work with material and make something, but the thought always becomes richer and more complex. It gains a kind of fidelity through actually making the work. I think this is a diagram I sometimes use to kind of conceptualize that process or that way of thinking. I think this is an idea that's really endemic to craft. In another way, this is an idea that the sociologist Richard Sennett talks about in his book, The Craftsman, when he quotes the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who has this famous quote where he says, "Food is both good to eat and good to think with." And Sennett actually applies that quote to clay as well. So by this, Lévi-Strauss means that From eating together comes the idea of cooking together. And from that issues forth the idea of sharing a space together. So we actually use the food to think with, to construct these kinds of forms. I meant to advance that slide. So I use, as Nathan said, I use a really wide range of different technologies in my work, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about technique and technology here. In this equivalent volumes piece, the volumes of the forms were sort of worked out using this little computer program, so a kind of Grasshopper, a little definition I created in a piece of software called Grasshopper, where you can really quickly kind of visualize different possibilities. So it's all of these equations, and you move these slider bars around, and then you get all of these different volumetric forms, which all share that consistent interior space. But then ultimately, all of these forms are just built by hand, directly hand-built. I think this is an idea that it's really sort of endemic to ceramics. I think about technology as a really long continuum. So I think about things like the potter's wheel and this kind of digital software as part of that same sort of long evolution. I also think about technology in terms of like really specific ways of achieving a result, but I also think about technology in really kind of broad ways. So in Michel Foucault's essay, The Technology of the Self, he talks about technology as basically tools or ideas, kind of conceptual structures that we've constructed in order to understand the notion of the self. And in this broader definition, technology is really any form of instrumental reason. So a lot of the work is kind of engaged in ideas which I feel are sort of germane to ceramics. The idea of pottery form as something figurative, something related to the body. Also pottery form as part of an evolving kind of morphology. So pottery form is something iterative, plastic, and evolving. This is a famous diagram from Philip Rawson's book, Ceramics. This is another kind of chart that I love. This actually is from a textbook, which is actually a study of linguistics, a study of cognitive linguistics, it's called. So an anthropologist came up with these charts as a way of mapping language in relation to geography. So he made all of these charts where a vase morphs into a bowl, right? Or a jar morphs into a cup. And then he turned these into flashcards, and he would travel around Mexico, and one at a time he would show them to people and ask them, what do you call this one? What do you call this one? What do you call this one? And then he would map the place where the word changes from one form to another. This is the beginning of a piece that I made a few years ago that is, again, sort of gathering together a number of these ideas and trying to sort of give this collection of ideas some kind of form. And specifically, this piece is about this notion that potters talk about, which is the idea of the breadth of the pot, which is this notion about a particular distribution of volume in a pottery form, and the idea that that has some connection to breathing, that act of inhaling or interior space. So the first step of making this piece was to make this little animation in which these two historical pottery forms kind of morph back and forth between one another. And one felt like it sort of exemplified the exhale, and the other the inhale. And then this piece was made using a mold, but I was really interested in the idea of, instead of making a series of molds, which is how I think you'd typically think about making a series of vessels like this, to think about the possibility of making this whole continuum of objects from one mold. So the piece was made using a computer numeric controlled milling machine and carving away an interior space out of a block of plaster, and then casting that interior, carving material away again, casting the interior, carving material away again. This is the mold in process in the studio. One of the casts, and then the whole series of objects there. And this is what the final installation looked like. And in some configurations, it's shown like this, just with this series of porcelain vessels on its own. In some configurations, it's shown alongside a video of the animation, and then also a large drawing in pencil, which kind of draws the forms one on top of another. So a second idea, which is sort of deeply ingrained in the long history of pottery, which I think about a lot in my work, is the idea of geometry, and specifically relationships between parts and wholes, how objects fit together to create a whole. This is a sort of amazing historical example of that idea at work. This is the facade of a shrine in Esfahan in Iran. And there's this incredible tiling pattern that's being employed here. And actually, in the early 2000s, a physicist from Harvard was traveling in Iran, and he was trying to figure out how they did this, so what the pattern was at work in these tiles, which seemed to use a limited amount of shapes, but never repeated over the surface. And what he discovered was that there was a geometric structure underlying this pattern called Penrose tiling, which is a structure that wasn't developed in the West until the 1970s. So I think that's this incredibly fascinating idea that these architects and craftsmen working on the surface of the building, thinking about how a material works, and trying to create an aesthetic effect, trying to create visual complexity in the surface, discovered this incredibly complex, abstract mathematical concept. I'm going to show you guys a series of pieces that I've been working with over the last few years, which are also working with geometry and actually three-dimensional shapes, which fit together, which tessellate. And this series of pieces really followed, I think in a way, a similar trajectory. So it started out as something very intuitive, and then over time, it seems like there's more and more layers and kind of complexity that I've been discovering and kind of unearthing, both in the way the forms fit together, but also some of the mathematics at play behind this geometric form. So the form that I've been working with is called a truncated octahedron. And it's something that I sort of came upon, again, really empirically, just by cutting little pieces of foam core out and taping them together. And then the first pieces were made by just slip casting a kind of cluster of those taped together foam core modules. And this piece on the left is a large kind of stack of those made in slip cast black porcelain. Here's another configuration of the same piece. This was in a large installation that was at the Denver Art Museum. Then I started getting interested in a similar notion about tessellating modules to build a larger whole. But I started thinking about ways in which to accomplish this, which would also engage some kind of porosity within the form. So the next iteration of the piece was made by introducing digital technology into the process. So there's a model on the left, and then another kind of algorithm applied to that model to smooth it into a more organic form. And then I knew I was going to use a mold-making process to fabricate this piece. So the challenge is to kind of take this really complicated, large organic form and try to break it down into a limited number of discrete modules, and then think about how you cast that element. And what I sort of came upon is all these really exciting efficiencies where this organic geometry kind of dovetails with the mold-making process. So with the process that I've been working with, which is actually the next process that we're going to get into in the digital tools class, rather than thinking about making a complete prototype with the digital tool, instead the way I kind of think about the form is by prototyping the mold for the form rather than the form itself. So the first step is to mill all of the mold parts, or actually molds for the mold parts, out of a rigid foam, then to cast those parts in plaster, put those pieces together to create a mold, and then it's incredibly exciting because actually the first time you ever see the complete geometry in physical space is when it comes out of the mold as the final porcelain material. So this is the casting process. I like to work really fast. There's a lot of work to get done. And then each of these modules, when you're casting with porcelain, you can kind of combine them really easily. And then the next sort of challenge is to think about an aggregate of these discrete parts, which you can lift in and out of the kiln, which is stackable. So all of these pieces are fired individually, and then you can stack them up to create this larger form or composition. And that's the finished fired piece. So this really exciting thing happened. I actually showed you a picture a little bit earlier in the talk, in the art stream component of a recent special student we had in our program. Her name's Camila Friedman-Gerlitz. And she is an amazing ceramic artist. She's in grad school now at University of Colorado at Boulder. And, but she came to us into our program with this really interesting background. So she'd actually been doing a PhD in mathematics at the University of Texas, and then decided that that calling wasn't for her, and she wanted to become a ceramic artist. So she spent 2 years studying in our program, was an amazing just person and energy to work with over that period of time. But she made a living while she was in school teaching classes in the math department of the university. And one of her colleagues in the math department invited she and I to go and give a lecture together in the math department. And so we gave this talk, and this is one of the pieces that I showed. And one of the mathematicians in the audience got really excited about this form, this truncated octahedron, because it was a form that he works with in his own work. And he described the reason why this form is really significant. And I'm going to totally paraphrase what he said. So what he said is, you can take any form in a certain number of dimensions and project it into additional dimensions. So I can take a one-dimensional form and project it into 2 dimensions. I can take a 2-dimensional form and project it into 3 dimensions, and on and on. This particular form is the only one where no matter how many dimensions you project it into, it's always space-filling. So it always fits together with no voids or gaps. And I have no idea what that means. But there's something so beautiful about that idea, and I actually am fascinated by that gap between the technical understanding of a form like this and a kind of empirical or artistic understanding. And I think it feels somehow deeply connected to that same sort of notion at work in those, Iranian tiles. This is another iteration of the same form, or using the same underlying geometry, and this is actually made out of a completely different material. It's made out of thin sheet aluminum, which is cut on a water jet and then riveted together with little pop rivets. And here it's shown within a kind of larger installation. And the thing that's really exciting about this piece is about 15 feet tall, but it packs down into like a shoebox. So it's like the most exciting thing. You go into a gallery space and you have your little shoebox with you, and you can like fill this incredible kind of volume by just spending, a day with your rivet gun and your little pieces of aluminum. And you can really sort of grow the form out to respond to the particular geometry of a room. So as I kind of lead into the last couple of bodies of work, I just wanted to touch a little bit more on this notion of still life and installation. So these last pieces with kind of geometry and space-filling polyhedrons, that's one notion about parts, how parts might create a whole, how multiple things go together to create a larger thing. Another way I think about this is through the notion of the still life. For me, the still life it's a kind of way of naming a part of my practice. It's about arranging in a way that kind of oscillates between rational and intuitive notions about how one organizes objects in a space. It's about thinking about both the objects themselves, but also the associations and connections, conversations and frictions between them. It's a practice that's both about creating meaning, but also about breaking meaning down, so it's generative and degenerative. It's also about using the studio as a technology to think with. This is the studio of the sculptor Constantine Brancusi. Two versions on the left, an image that Brancusi took of his own studio. On the right, this is his studio kind of recurated and cleaned up by the architect Renzo Piano as it's currently installed outside of the Pompidou Center in Paris. This is a piece that I made about 10 years ago now that was a kind of homage to that space. It was made for the NCECA conference in Portland, Oregon. Last time NCECA was in Portland, and it snowed in the middle of the conference on the piece. This is a recent installation at the Denver Art Museum. So there were these three elements to my contribution to the show. This collection of these black polyhedra on the left-hand side on the floor, this long pedestal piece that's about 12 feet long, the aluminum pedestal in the middle, and then a 13-foot high wall, which is covered on both sides with these large press-molded ceramic tiles. So I want to just conclude by talking about two recent installations. These two installations were made for the same gallery space called Haw Contemporary in Kansas City, Missouri. They were made almost exactly 1 year apart from each other. So one was made and installed in 2014, and the next one was installed in 2015. Each of these shows is really, again, I think about this notion of parts and wholes. Each object within the show is a kind of complete thought on its own, and then they come together to create a kind of constellation of ideas. So I hope that the entire show becomes this kind of physical manifestation of this sort of thinking process. It's a record of the complexity and messiness and moments of clarity within the work of thinking. And I'll just talk about a few of the specific pieces. So I'll just show you the images and just speak to a couple of them. This is the back and then the front. It's funny, you can laugh, it's okay. I have a piece called Maplethorpe. This amazing conversation, okay, you get good. This amazing conversation with one of the art writers from the Kansas City Star who thought that this piece was a reference to the Maplethorpe photograph Man with Whip, which is a photograph of Robert Mapplethorpe bending over with a bullwhip shoved in his butt. It actually, I thought was about the Robert Mapplethorpe piece, Man in a Gray Suit. Is that the name of it? Which is just this photograph from the waist down of a man with the fly of this beautiful gray suit, and then this sort of giant phallus hanging out of the front of the suit. And I got to have this great kind of back and forth with this writer about the formal relationships between these two photographs in this piece, and made my case for why it was a homage to one rather than the other. But this piece is all coil built, it's pinched, and I think, to me this piece is about this kind of duality of working with clay, of pinching. So on one hand, there's this notion of this incredible, a kind of control, there's this masculinity kind of embedded in it, and then on the other hand, it's sort of this fussy, masturbatory kind of activity. This is the second exhibition, which was called Architecture of Touch. This is a piece that was called Cactus Kuros Kintsugi, about cacti, kuros, both the Cycladic, the Greek figures, but also Osamu Noguchi's version of the kuros figures, and then kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken ceramic pieces. The kuros figures were always these kind of about a sort of idealization of youthful bodies, about sort of proportion and beauty. And this piece was a way of kind of thinking about, young bodies and then aging bodies, and how the youthful body kind of transitions into middle age and becomes awkward. Sometimes. Couple more images. This large aluminum piece was called Wad Kuvad. The kuvad is this term from anthropology, which sort of refers to this wide range of different practices undertaken by men to try to empathetically experience childbirth. So that kind of impossibility. This piece started with this little ball of aluminum foil. So this was this little piece of detritus that was kind of floating around my studio space for a number of years. And for whatever reason, it's one of those things that kind of exists in the periphery and you don't throw it away. And then at some point you realize that you're keeping it for some reason and try to make it into something. I took a really high resolution 3D scan of this ball of aluminum foil and then kind of painstakingly in the computer unfolded it into flat surfaces, and then cut all of these out of a thicker sheet of aluminum. The thickness of the aluminum was scaled proportionately to the scaling of the overall form. And then over a 2-day period with very little sleep, pop riveted this form back together, folding all of the pieces by hand and then folding tabs into the interior of the form, and by hand putting 1,000 pop rivets into the inside of the shape. This is a piece called Parametric Chair. This piece is about this idea, this kind of possibility that designers talk a lot about with digital fabrication technology, the possibility of mass customization. So the idea that you could make a whole bunch of things for production, and rather than standardizing them, every piece could be unique. So the chair is actually what's called a parametric model, which is similar to that model I showed you earlier, which was about visualizing these different volumes. So you can move sliders around and create chairs which are particular to individual bodies, and then cut them on the CNC mill and put them together. So there were a number of these chairs within the space of the gallery, and I think they kind of, they're a number of things, right? They're a kind of design project, they're a chair, but they also exist as it's a place to sit and rest as you're in the space of the gallery. And then this last piece, which I wanted to wrap back around to, this is this cast bronze aloe plant. So this piece, this was kind of about skin and flesh, I think. As a fair-skinned boy growing up, I got a lot of sunburns, and this sort of ritual of cutting one of the limbs or off of the aloe plant and rubbing the gel into your skin was like just this part of summertime. And I was fascinated. So this is an aloe plant that my wife and I lived with for a number of years. We grew it from this really small plant. And then I decided to cast it in bronze. And in order to cast it in bronze, of course, you have to kill it. So it started as this really full, lush kind of plant, and through the mold making process, it sort of shriveled slightly and became kind of desiccated. I was also really interested in how sharp it became. Whereas you cast it in bronze, it moves from something that performs as a kind of salve on the skin to something that could pierce or cut the flesh. I think the piece, it makes me think about the problems with memorials, the way they aspire to preserve something, but ultimately can inflict a lot of damage as well. Sort of a weird way to end. I didn't think about that part of the sequence. Yeah, sorry. Thanks for coming.